Well, good evening. I thought I wanted to talk to you a little bit about Harry Truman. We're going to spend a lot of time with old Harry over the first, 3 chapters of our book, the first 3 weeks that we are together. And he's one of those guys who is such a fascinating president for a number of reasons. He is the example of the proof that any man can grow up and become president and do a fine job, because he did. And he was probably one of the least likely people ever to become president in our country's history. Harry is the last man to be president of the United States who did not attend college. Frankly, his parents were too poor. They'd used whatever money they had to send his older brother, and by the time it was Harry's turn, there wasn't any money. Harry was born in May of 1884, May 8, 1884, in a little town, Grandview, I think it was, Missouri. His father operated a farm, like many Americans in those days especially. Harry grew up with really bad eyesight, horrible eyesight, that he had to wear glasses. And as a result, his parents discouraged him from doing anything that typical boys did. He didn't play games. He said once, he says, I wasn't really good with my fists. He says, I didn't play games. He says, to tell you the truth, when I was a boy, I was kind of a sissy. Well, he was kind of a sissy because his parents said they couldn't afford to replace his glasses, and so he had to take care of them. He met a curly-haired, blonde, blue-eyed girl named Bess Wallace when he was 6 and she was 5. He met her in Sunday school. He would literally carry her books home from school. He was so in awe of this beautiful little girl that he couldn't even bring himself to say her name until he was, about 10, so for 4 years. He had probably the longest courtship. He proposed to Bess when she was 25 and he was 26, and she said no. He proposed to her again when he was 27, and she said no, and 28, and she said no. The proposal and the rejection went on for 10 years until finally she said yes. And she said, but let's wait till you get back from the war just to be sure that you still want to do it and that you're okay. So 10 years after the proposal, the first proposal, Harry Truman married Bess Wallace. It's really a shame. Bess's mom, Bess came from some money. Her family was very prominent in the little town of Independence, Missouri. And Bess's mother, Harry's mother-in-law now, didn't really much like her new son-in-law. She thought that Bess had married beneath herself, that this guy just wasn't good enough. And that belief carried on through all the rest of her life with Harry. In 1948, when Harry Truman is now President of the United States, his mother-in-law would tell anyone who would listen that she couldn't understand why people did not like that Mr. Dewey, that nice man, and why anybody would vote a poor old Missouri dirt farmer, her son-in-law, to be president of the United States. Harry had to be exceptionally patient. He gets into politics when he is about 40. He had made friends with the nephew of a very prominent man in Independence, and Harry got his first political job as essentially a county supervisor. He did battle with the Ku Klux Klan. He hated the Ku Klux Klan and went to them and basically went into one of their meetings, barged into one of their meetings, and he said to the Ku Klux Klan members, he says, if you guys give me any trouble, he says, you just come right up right now and I'll give you a punch in the nose. great courage to walk into a Ku Klux Klan meeting. Harry was an interesting guy. He said that there are three things that ruin a man. One is having too much power too soon. One is having too much money too soon. He said those separate you from the rest of humanity. And he said women can ruin a man. Well, not so much women, but running around trying to find them, I guess. In Harry's case, there were three women in his life. Pardon me, four. His mother, who he idolized, his sister, who he took exceedingly great care of, his wife Bess, and his one and only child, his daughter Margaret. He adored them. In fact, once as president, he is off at a conference, I think it was the Potsdam Conference, and he had an army sergeant who was driving him around. And the sergeant said to him, "Now, Mr. President, if you need anything, you just call on me and I'll make it happen." And Truman said, "Well, thank you. I appreciate it." And the guy says, "Well, Mr. President, if you need anything." And Truman said, "Well, yeah, thank you. I really appreciate your kindness." And the sergeant thinks, boy, this guy is really dumb. And he finally comes out with it. He said, "Mr. President, if you need anything, like women, you just ask me." And Truman, of course, wore glasses. His kind of bluish gray eyes were always magnified, being like a kind of an angry owl behind those glasses. And he looked at the man with these big eyes and he said, "Now don't you ever let me hear you talk like that again. I don't run around on my baby and my baby doesn't run around on me. Don't ever speak like that in my presence again." Well, I don't know what the Army sergeant ever thought about that, but as far as we know, he never brought that subject up again. In 1944, Harry Truman is a senator from Missouri. The Democrats are meeting in Chicago. The party bosses, the leaders of the party, kind of believed, they couldn't say it, but they believed that they were really nominating two presidents in 1944. They were nominating, of course, Franklin D. Roosevelt, but anybody who'd been around him knew he was dying. And so when the Democrats met in Chicago in 1944, they came not to nominate one president, but two. Whoever was going to be vice president, the Democrat power leaders reasoned would ultimately be president, and sooner than later. The party power leaders decided that the current vice president, Henry Wallace, was not good enough, and they wanted Harry Truman. They thought they could do business with him. They thought he was level-headed. They thought if the worst were to happen, he could take over for Franklin Roosevelt and do a great job. Well, that is exactly what happened. He is nominated as vice president. He meets with Roosevelt in the White House a week or so later. He had never seen Roosevelt, or at least not seen him for about a year. He watches Roosevelt, and he said he watched Roosevelt pour his cream into his coffee cup, and he said he was shaking so badly he could hardly pour the cream. And one of Truman's family was with him, and he said, "Harry, that man's dying, and you're going to be president." And Truman said, "Yeah, I know, and it scares the hell out of me." So here we are, Thursday, April 12th, 1945, 5 o'clock in the afternoon. Harry Truman, Vice President of the United States for 82 days, is now in the Speaker of the House of Representatives office. Have a little bourbon and branch water. They called it taking a blow for liberty. And kind of just visiting, those kind of interpersonal relationships that are so important in getting things done. And Truman just got into the Speaker's office when a phone call came from the White House saying that Harry needed to go to the White House right away. Well, he thought, Roosevelt's in Georgia. Maybe he came back early and needed to talk to me. He refused to let his head get around the idea that something might be wrong with President Roosevelt. He ran, however, through the down under the basement of the Capitol to the White House, through the various tunnels that connect, and he gets to the president's, the family residence on the second floor, and there was the president's wife, Eleanor Roosevelt. She looks at Harry Truman and she says, "Harry, the president is dead." And Truman looked at her and he said, "Mrs. Roosevelt, is there anything we can do for you?" That is so Harry Truman. Everything that has ever been said about him was he was an exceedingly kind man. Mrs. Roosevelt looked at him, put her hand on his shoulder and said, "Harry, is there anything we can do for you? Because you're the one that's in trouble now." The next morning, Friday, April 13, Friday the 13th, how's that for your first day as president? Truman sees the newspaper reporters and he says to them this: "Boys, I don't know if you've ever been on a farm and if you've ever had a load of hay fall on you, but yesterday I had the sun, the moon, the planets, and all the stars fall on me. Boys, if you have ever prayed in your life, pray for me now, because I'm going to need it." Well, we'll talk more about Harry in chapter 2 and chapter 3, but I wanted to give you a little background about him. The funny thing, when he leaves the White House in 1953, 22% of Americans thought he had done a good job. Fewer Americans thought Harry Truman had done a good job in 1953 than thought Richard Nixon had done a good job on the day Nixon resigned. And yet now, well over 60 years since Truman leaves the White House, historians have him ranked as one of the 10 greatest presidents in our history. Well, a lot more about him over the next few weeks, but I wanted to give you a little background. Have a wonderful evening. Oh yeah, if you've lived through all of these stories, a couple of things. Number one, make sure that you're looking at the syllabus. Make sure that you're looking at the calendar. There are some things that will be due this weekend: a quiz, a discussion question. You'll see that post that's up already under discussions. Also, remember, I want to meet with you. So if you haven't set up a time with me, let's get that done this week, next week, the week after. But I really want to meet you. I want to get to know you. I want to be able to answer any of the questions you have that might be troubling you about this class or how it is set up. The last thing I want to say to you is this, and I say this to everybody as I'm interviewing them. The fun thing about this particular class and the way we're going to have to do it, thanks to COVID, is we can actually make this class a little more tailor-made to you and what you want. So if there's some people you want to talk about, call me, text me, email me, FaceTime me. Let's talk about them. Or send me a note and say, "Hey, would you do a little special on this guy?" I'd be happy to. Have a wonderful day, you guys. It is great to get to meet you all. Bye-bye.